Whether your advisory firm has 1 or 5 people, compliance will always be an issue. RIA Compliance Concepts is more than just another service provider. We truly care about seeing our clients prosper. That's why we started our podcast, the RIA Compliance Collective, providing up-to-date compliance guidance. We're passionate about doing our job so you can focus on doing your job. We understand regulatory compliance like the back of our hands, from full-service RIA registration to annual compliance reviews and everything in between. We're here to get you there.
Hello and welcome to the RIA Compliance Collective. I'm your host, Ivan Barretto, and I've got my co-hosts with me, Megan Campbell and Collin O'Brien. How are you guys doing this morning?
Doing pretty good. How about you?
Good. How about you, Collin? How's everything in your world?
I'm doing outstanding.
Well, it's good. Well, one of the topics we're going to talk about today is a serious topic that's going to be a very important compliance issue for years to come, and that's senior vulnerability and financial exploitation. According to the U.S. Census, by 2050, 20% of the population will be over the age of 65 and older. So this obviously is an important topic because you're going to see more and more of this taking place over the next few years, where seniors are going to be at the point where they're going to be vulnerable and can be exploited financially by friends, family members, and outright strangers. In recent months, we've seen in the news, this has become prevalent in the news, that Stan Lee, the creator of the Marvel Comics characters that you see in the blockbuster movies like Avengers and Spider-Man and Iron Man and whatnot, he apparently has filed several lawsuits against some of his former business partners and people that have taken control of his account, that have basically taken money away from him or stolen money away from him, or actually used his blood in one case where they were selling his blood to rabid comic book fans for money, which is something that is definitely alarming, that this can happen to pretty much anyone, whether you're a public figure or not a public figure. But Collin, I know when we've discussed previously that you had a similar instance in your family a few years or several years back with your grandpa, right? And can you kind of elaborate a little bit on what happened with your grandfather?
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit on the Stan Lee thing. That's kind of sick and scary. But my own personal experience, I was, albeit a little kid at the time, but my grandfather, he was walking out of the grocery store, H-E-B, down in San Antonio, and 2 guys grabbed him and they drove around and had him cash a bunch of checks around San Antonio. And yeah, it's just one of those things that it's just out and out scary. I don't know the exact details because this is well over 30 years ago, but yeah, it can happen to anybody. And as regulators, I know I have, and I know that you guys have been on several phone calls with clients that have been defrauded. And you're sitting here listening to an elderly person crying on the telephone because all the retirement is gone by one fraud or another. And it is scary. It is a scary threat, and it's a very real threat. So,
and what's scary is the various scams that are available. I mean, we've done our research, all of us, and we've seen like the various ways that people can take advantage of you, whether it's someone calling you randomly over the phone asking for your social security number because, your taxes are late. It could, requesting, and someone has hacked a client's email requesting money. I mean, they're getting more sophisticated as far as the people that can take advantage of elderly clients. They're getting a little bit more sophisticated in those terms. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely this topic is definitely something that's not going to go away. And what the states have typically done now and nationally for the SEC and FINRA have established more stricter guidelines on how to address this, and basically putting the responsibility on the financial service professionals like an RIA or a broker dealer or a registered rep of a broker dealer. And I know, Megan, you looked into some of those guidelines. Can you elaborate a little bit more what you kind of came up with as far as the things that a financial or RIAs or financial professionals need to be aware of based off of the regulation that's out there?
Yeah. So the states and, the SEC and FINRA, they've kind of been on the front line of this. And even, a decade ago, put out some guidelines for financial service professionals. And basically it was, what should you look at when you're opening accounts? How do you train your employees to identify red flags for diminished capacity and financial exploitation? And how to identify, if there's elder abuse actually going on. And just a couple of years ago in 2016, a lot of states started adopting this model legislation that was put out that gives them a little bit more oomph behind this movement. So basically it gives investment advisors the ability to, or the requirement, it's mandated to contact certain state agencies regarding suspected financial abuse of elders and vulnerable adults. And it gives the ability to maybe delay disbursements if there is suspected financial exploitation. And it gives you the ability to disclose and report suspected abuse to other third-party agencies that maybe aren't state securities regulators, but definitely have an interest in protecting this vulnerable population. Since that came out in 2016, so far 17 states have actually enacted legislation regarding that model rule, and 3 states already had some similar legislation on the books.
Yeah, and so then that's definitely going to continue trending. So all of the states have something to address this. And it's not just, securities regulators that are addressing this too, right? We're seeing it prevalent in all departments that deal with the aging population, and whether it's in Texas, it's the Department of Aging and Disability Services. So there's multiple regulators and multiple agencies, including the law enforcement agencies, depending on how egregious it is, that you have to be aware of and cognizant of when you do come across something like this, which typically it's interesting. We're going to segue into what do you do when you do come across something? You have a client that is getting exploited. Obviously, number one, at the forefront of everything is to have policies and procedures addressing this, right? And then training your staff accordingly to recognize seniors with diminished capacity and have training to spot financial exploitation and the warning signs for that. A lot of RIAs, I know our listeners are RIAs and financial professionals, want to know is what do they do, like when they come across a case like this. And Collin, I know you've, as a former SEC and FINRA regulator and state regulator, obviously, you have kind of an inside track of what you would expect in documenting something that is occurring like this. And can you elaborate, I guess, what your thought process is as far as what an RIA or a financial professional should do to report this issue or that where a client's getting taken advantage of?
Well, there's several actions that an RIA can do to help protect their clients. I think that to start out with, and I think that's important, is that you research what the fraudulent scams look like and train your staff on how to recognize fraudulent scams. Usually the scams by strangers, you can have home repair or traveling con men. So if you have if you have a client that's withdrawing an unordinary amount from their account to get a roof replaced or get their driveway coated or what have you, or if there's a charity scam, if they're wanting to send money to a charity and you don't recognize it, do a little research on that. And the list can go on and on. It's even sad, it's not just strangers too. It's also common people that they know. It could be their caretaker, it can be their neighbors, their friends, their pastor. I mean, even their family members can be perpetrators on this. If you have a client that wants to change their power of attorney, ask those probing questions. If they want to give signatory authority over their checking accounts, ask those probing questions. Ask why, what's going on here, and set up a trusted contact prior to having that diminished capacity. Now,
and that's another thing with you, like in our industry, in the financial service industry and compliance professionals, that as compliance professionals, what we typically see is clients that get taken advantage of are based off of investment promises for, private investment offerings or whatnot. That's the common thing that advisors typically see, and they're promised these returns, astronomical returns or a fixed return to invest in this product that could turn out to be a fraudulent investment. And that's something that you definitely, as financial RIAs or financial professionals, do your due diligence in that product to see if it fits in with, the client's suitability and suitability guidelines and investment objectives. 9 times out of 10, we see these elderly clients come to the RIAs or financial professionals are referencing, hey, someone contacted me on the phone about this investment that is guaranteeing me 20% return on my money. I want to invest in it. I really want to invest in it. And as a RIA, they're coming to you asking you advice on investing in it. Then so they're at the forefront and doing the due diligence to make sure that this is appropriate for the client, obviously. With that being said, getting the right information and documenting it is always important when relaying this information to a regulator. But there are resources that we've come across and that you've come across, Collin, right, that are good for clients or RIA firms or financial professionals to look into if they have additional questions. And what are some of the resources that you've come across that are really going to be helpful for RIAs and other financial professionals to look into when it comes to this topic?
Well, as far as security go, NASAA, the North American Securities Administration Association, not the organization that makes rockets, is a good place to locate the contact information for your local regulator, your state regulator. If you're associated with FINRA, FINRA definitely has tools that you can use to be able to report a possible fraud. And there's other organizations. If you think that it might be a reverse mortgage that's in line or a fraudulent loan that's in line, the Customer Financial Protection Bureau would be a good place to start. If you believe it's an internet fraud, the Internet Crime Complaint Center. And there's several other organizations like AARP, Foundation ElderWatch is a good place, or the National Fraud Information Center is a good place to look at. There's several things that you can do when you report that. A good tool, if you have a lot of seniors as clients, is to have an awareness document authored that gives the client brief overviews of fraudulent schemes, where the warning signs of perpetrators, the caution on what happens if somebody's asking you to withdraw money from your account, that there's different places that the client can send information to the authorities and include that contact information, whether it be, financial institution regulatory authorities or federal or state law enforcement authorities. There's definitely a lot of tools. If you suspect elderly financial exploitation and you want to file a complaint, you should file that report. And what you need to include on that report is the name, age, and address of the person who might be the victim, your name and contact information, a brief description of the situation and the relationship that you have with the victim. If there's any injuries or medical or behavioral problems that the victim might be having, any siblings or contact or relatives inside or outside of the home, and do a nice little explanation on what you know about the situation. These are always good items to do. And if there's a suspicious activity then that qualifies for a SARS report, then you always have that option to file a SARS report with FinCEN. So there's definitely lots of avenues to explore there. And it's just a matter of fact of trying to do this. So.
And that's great. Ultimately, what our goal is with all our podcasts that we put out there is to give some guidance to our listening public that subscribes to our podcast of ways to handle tricky compliance issues. So with that being said, guys, this is our first podcast. I think we did, this is a great topic, and we have future topics that we're formulating as we speak. I guess, Collin, what do you think would be a good podcast topic for future reference for RIAs?
Well, I think that seeing that hurricane season is right around the corner, that maybe business continuity planning might be a good subject. There's been some studies conducted by the SEC recently, specifically saying the Fort Worth office, that we could probably bring some light and give some advice there.
And that's interesting you brought that up, because I remember we attended one of the compliance roundtables here in Austin, the Austin Compliance Roundtable. And that's one of the things that they brought to light was that after one of the hurricanes, I can't remember which one. Do you remember?
I think it was Harvey.
Harvey.
Yeah,
Harvey in Houston, that they started contacting SEC firms in their region to do kind of a microscopic audit on the business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan stuff. So yeah, that's definitely a topic that I think is great to understand. And one of the things that I find interesting is we get that question all the time, like, how do you test a business continuity plan? How do you test a disaster recovery plan? And that's something we'll address in our podcast, but it's interesting that that comes up quite a bit. But obviously that podcast would be great. Now, Megan, on your end, what do you think would be a good compliance topic for one of our up and coming podcasts?
I think cybersecurity, it's on the forefront. It is always an issue. It's been an issue here for the last few years, but it's something that the regulators still want to see financial professionals have, procedures in case there's some sort of a breach and how they protect their clients' information.
Yeah, and that's something we're discovering too, is that cybersecurity is a very important topic, but some of the firms some RAs out there, the lingo is the thing that trips everyone up. When we tell them our advice, RIAs out there, they need to address this, but there's certain things that we probably will clarify in the podcast of important keywords that they need to be aware of so they understand when they put together a cybersecurity policy to understand the lingo involved in that. As for myself, I think one of the interesting topics for our next podcast is kind of the overall misconceptions on certain things that have to be disclosed or how fees are disclosed or reviewed. I think kind of a general compliance podcast would be good to address some kind of these little things that we see on our end that some RIA should be aware of from, outside business activity. When should they report it? There's always confusion about that. There's always confusion about, how to disclose fees. I think those are some good topics. Some kind of a general compliance podcast would be good. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. And just remember, we're always here to get you there.
Thank you for listening to the RIA Compliance Collective. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you want to experience the RIA Compliance Concepts difference yourself, visit riacc.io. From mock audits to customized compliance procedures, ongoing compliance assistance, and beyond, we're here for you always. Keep listening to discover more on how you can keep your advisory firm compliant so you can focus on achieving your goals. RIA Compliance Concepts. We're here to get you there.